Avatar The Last Airbender is my favorite TV show ever created. I've watched through it 3 times in the past year alone, and each time I picked up on hidden character nuances, jokes that had previously gone over my head, and new lines of reasoning for why things are the way they are in this universe. The show has some of the best writing I've seen in any TV series, let alone one that was made for kids. Even though the show came out over 10 years ago, people are still talking about its many themes, imaginative world, and compelling characters. The successor to Avatar The Last Airbender, The Legend of Korra, is then faced with the mammoth task of continuing to build on a world that so many people have grown to love. Unfortunately, for a lot of viewers, The Legend of Korra did not deliver. When explaining what makes Korra an unworthy sequel, critics point to bad writing, underdeveloped characters, and a removal of elements that made Avatar The Last Airbender special. But I disagree. While it is not as good as Avatar, The Legend of Korra effectively expands upon the world built by its predecessor, introduces new and compelling characters, and introduces complicated themes that are explored fairly well, especially given the time allotted to each season. So let's delve in more specifically to the reasons why I believe that The Legend of Korra is an excellent sequel to Avatar The Last Airbender. Avatar The Last Airbender delivered audiences an interesting world completed by distinct groups of benders. Each bending group differs considerably in their appearances, clothing, personalities, and living spaces. As Team Avatar traveled around the world throughout the course of the show, it was easy to tell where they were simply based on the terrain and the people they were interacting with. But a theme that permeates throughout the series is the idea of separation. Even Avatar Roku, the literal embodiment of different bending types and ideologies, subscribes to this idea. There is fairly limited teamwork between members of different bending groups, exemplified by the Earth Kingdom and the Water Tribes defending themselves against the Fire Nation as individual entities rather than in a concerted effort. The only groups that transcend the divisions of bending type are Team Avatar and the Order of the White Lotus. The limited interaction between different bending groups is in tension with the message delivered by Zuko at the end of the war, where he promises to work with Aang to restore balance to the entire world. The Legend of Korra, however, follows through on the idea of increasing togetherness amongst the people of different nations. First, there is the setting of Republic City. People of all bending abilities, including non-benders, live together in one space with the existence of important sites such as Air Temple Island and the Water Tribe Cultural Center to promote diversity. I mean, the very existence of the United Forces, which employs non-benders and benders of all types, is a testament to the idea that concluded The Last Airbender. We can keep the world safe and balanced together. Second, there's pro-bending. Now, most of my friends are not fans of pro-bending, and I have to admit I'm not crazy about it either. Still, I think it serves 2 very important functions in terms of acquainting us with this world. One, if people who primarily used bending as a means of enhancing their livelihoods and defending themselves in a war are now using bending for sport, it shows the audience that there's been an absence of serious conflict for quite some time. This suggests that the Avatar is not really a necessary part of the world, at least at the show's beginning, which is an important motif that exists throughout the Legend of Korra series. 2, each pro bending team incorporates 3 different types of benders. They all have to be completely in sync to win, which speaks volumes about the ability of different benders to work together well in this world. In Avatar, I thought that the Order of White Lotus's attack on Ba Sing Se encapsulated this very well. They all used each other's abilities to magnify their own and watched each other's backs. Each team in the pro bending arena was able to do this, even the team that cheated, suggesting that by this point in the Avatar universe, people have achieved a clear understanding of how to attain synergy among the bending types. Republic City is also home to technological advancements that don't exist in the original Avatar, including the Satomobile and skyscrapers. I'm completely sold on Republic City as the main setting for The Legend of Korra, but I also really like Zaofu, along with the increased exploration of the spirit world. The spirit world plays an important role in Avatar The Last Airbender, but it definitely leaves the viewer asking a lot of questions. Why is the Avatar the only one who can be the bridge between the real world and the spirit world? Is there a connection between the Avatar's past lives and the spirit world? Is the Avatar state connected to the spirit world? Avatar The Last Airbender leaves you largely in the dark about these questions, but The Legend of Korra is able to answer them in only 2 episodes. For some of my friends, Beginnings Part 1 and 2 are their favorite episodes across both Avatar The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra, and I can see why. In just 2 episodes, The Legend of Korra is able to explain who the first Avatar was, give him some backstory, give a reasonable explanation for the lion turtles, explain the spirits, explain that the Avatar is a fusion of a normal human with a light spirit, explain the Avatar cycle of reincarnation, and explain the spirit portals. I thought that these episodes answered most of the questions I had about Avatar and the spirit world in a clear, effective manner, and I am completely in favor of how the origin story expands upon the universe. In regards to world building, I truly do think The Legend of Korra does justice to the sentiments expressed in the conclusion of The Last Airbender, and expands on some of its more underdeveloped ideas. Fans love the original Team Avatar, with Zuko's edginess, Aang's optimism, Katara's motherly attitude, Sokka's wit, Suki's skill, and Toph's sarcasm. For many, the new version of Team Avatar that appears in The Legend of Korra does not hold a candle to the original team. People believe that Korra, MaCo, Bolin, and Asami are not as developed or compelling as the members of Team Avatar in The Last Airbender. While reasonable minds can certainly differ on this issue, I believe that the Korra Team Avatar develops in more interesting ways than most of the members of the Last Airbender Team Avatar. Now, before you get angry and dismiss me as some quack who doesn't know what he's talking about, please allow me to go through each character and explain myself in more detail. Let's start with the original Team Avatar. Now, I want to start by saying that I absolutely love all of these characters. I think, even disregarding the bending spectacles or flashy combat moves that many of them are able to execute, they are genuinely entertaining to watch, and I find myself relating to them in many instances during the show. With that said, I do think that many of these characters stay more or less the same as the series unfolds. I think Katara exemplifies my point the best. From Book 1 all the way through Book 3, Katara remains a kind, caring person who is willing to put any innocent individual before herself or even the ultimate mission to take down the Fire Lord. In Book 1, this identifying aspect of her character was shown in the episode Imprisoned, where she infiltrates a Fire Nation prison ship in order to save Earth Kingdom prisoners. In Book 3, another episode, The Painted Lady, is devoted to showing the exact same character trait in almost the exact same manner. She finds out that innocent civilians are having their livelihoods threatened by the Fire Nation, so she disguises herself in an attempt to help the oppressed people, encourages them to be confident in themselves and reclaim their means of living, and is ultimately thanked for her help. This begs the question, did Katara really change all that much as the series progressed? I would say not really. Sure, there are isolated moments of growth, such as when she learned to work out her differences with Toph, or when she had to deal with being a bloodbender, or when she decided to spare the man who killed her mother. But all of her major decisions boil down to her care for others. Katara, after hearing how positively she impacted Sokka and Toph because of her care, decides to reconcile with Toph. After learning bloodbending, Katara uses bloodbending once, at a moment in her life when she was almost completely consumed by rage, and then in The Legend of Korra we find out that she had outlawed the practice. At the moment she was able to kill her mother's assailant, she stopped. She just couldn't do it. Why? Because doing so would betray the fundamental premise through which she bases her actions. She's a person with a willingness to put her own life on the line in order to help people who need it the most. She is a person who does her best to preserve life, not take it away, which is something that never changes in the show. So then let's look at Toph. Toph doesn't really change in the show either. She's introduced as a tough, sassy, headstrong fighter who deep down cares for her friends, even if she doesn't show it. She ends the exact same way. The biggest moment of development comes when she decides to write to her parents, but this action does not change any fundamental aspect of her character, which considerably lessens its impact. Suki is likely the most static member of Team Avatar, which isn't surprising considering she gets the least screen time. She starts out as a skilled warrior and leader who is quickly able to assess a situation and act appropriately. She ends that way too. Sokka, I would say, is one of the characters who has more development on Team Avatar. When you first meet him, it's easy to dismiss him as comic relief, but he's so much more than that. He goes from being kind of a jerk, as seen from the way he treats Aang and Suki when he first meets them, to a witty tactician. Across all 3 books, he comes up with ingenious plans and inventions to aid Team Avatar, including the plan to try and open the fire temple of Crescent Island using bombs, the plan to take down the Ba Sing Se drill from the inside, the invasion plan, the plan to escape the boiling rock, and the plan to take down the Fire Nation airships. I think the biggest change that Sokka goes through as the series unfolds is his increase in self-confidence. He, in a group of people who all have astounding abilities, needs to find a place for himself as a normal person. And throughout his journey to find this place, he grows closer with his friends and his heritage. He becomes a more versatile thinker, a more capable leader, and of course, a more skilled swordsman. Still, while Sokka definitely grows as the series progresses, I don't think he is ever faced with a situation that uproots his fundamental goal, to help Aang defeat the Fire Nation. Sokka may experience doubt in his own abilities, but that doesn't change who he is as a person. He starts out as a guy who wishes to protect his family and friends from the Fire Nation, and he ends as a guy who has the confidence to carry out that desire into action. Aang obviously is another character who has development on Team Avatar. He, like Katara and Toph, has isolated moments of growth, such as when he was faced with the realization of the death of his people, when he has to deal with being missing for 100 years, when he has to deal with Appa being kidnapped, when he goes into training with Guru Patik, and when he has to deal with the world thinking he's dead. But, like we did with all of the other characters, let's look at Aang in the beginning of the show versus him at the end. Yes, by the end of the show, he did grow much more mature and confident in himself as the Avatar, much like how Sokka grew much more confident in his identity. However, even by the show's end, he's still a warm-hearted individual who isn't ready to assume all of the responsibilities and sacrifices that come with being the Avatar. Throughout the series, various figures tell Aang that he has to be ready to do things that he might not like in order to fulfill the duty of the Avatar. Bumi tells him that he can't use normal airbender tactics and has to think outside of the box. General Fong tells him that he needs to use the Avatar state. Guru Patik tells him that he needs to let go of Katara, and finally, his friends and past Avatar lives tell him that he needs to kill the Fire Lord in order to end the war. Aang's decision at the end of the show to spare the Fire Lord is a pivotal moment in his character arc. His decision definitely is courageous and a fine way to end the show, but it also demonstrates that Aang is an avatar who is bound by personal beliefs. He draws the line in restoring balance to the world when it comes to taking another life. It shows us that Aang is still a boy who doesn't really want to be the avatar. So yes, Aang may have grown into a stronger and wiser person, but he never let any situation betray his adherence to his own moral compass, even one that involved a superpowered fascist trying to lay waste to the Earth Kingdom. Last but certainly not least, we have Zuko. I don't think anyone would have a problem by me saying that Zuko is easily the most interesting character in Team Avatar and probably in the entire show. His redemption arc is compelling, and it's really rewarding to see his transformation from villain to anti-hero to hero, since you really feel like he learned and grew as the series progressed. It's obvious that the writers knew what they were doing with Zuko, unlike in some shows. Part of the reason why I think Zuko is such an interesting character is because his lines of reasoning are constantly challenged by outside forces. His quest for honor in capturing the Avatar is challenged by his uncle. His willingness to live his life as a refugee with his uncle is challenged by the arrival of both Aang and Azula. The question of his destiny is challenged by Azula and his uncle at the same time. Finally, when he thinks he has everything he wanted, he is challenged by his own feelings of internal turmoil at whether or not he made the right decision. Zuko is constantly exposed to new environments and different characters, causing him to adapt his mindset in order to figure out what he wants and what his destiny is. Everyone I talked about before Zuko knew what they wanted from day one: stop the Fire Lord and bring balance back to the world. Zuko didn't know what he wanted until late in the game, and his journey to understand who he was and what his destiny was is something that I truly found uplifting to watch. So now we turn our attention to the new Team Avatar. What's interesting about the members of this new team is that they, like Zuko, are constantly exposed to new environments and people that change them in various ways. The original Team Avatar may have met many people throughout their journey, but they never lost sight of their goal: defeat the Fire Nation. The people they met were either villains who tried to detract from that goal, or allies who tried to promote that goal. It's not that simple with the new Team Avatar, because there's no overarching mission that is constraining each of its members. Rather, each member of this new team has their own values and goals that sometimes come into conflict with one another. We're able to see how this iteration of Team Avatar responds to the new threats and settings of each season on an individual basis rather than with the concerted mindset that exists in The Last Airbender. I personally believe that this is a much more interesting route to take, and I do think that The Legend of Korra performed admirably in its chosen path of characterization. With that introductory note in place, let's look at the specifics of each character. Let's start with Asami. She's a fan favorite character in The Legend of Korra, and it's easy to see why. She's smart, skilled at fighting, and very kind, much like The Last Airbender's Suki. However, unlike Suki, she's challenged by new developments that sprout up in each season that cause her to broaden her field of vision and fundamentally change her lifestyle. Asami is introduced as a rich girl who can basically get anything she wants in life. But once she finds out that her father is conspiring with the Equalists, she's forced to fight against him. She then has to learn how to transition into a life on Air Temple Island while still helping Korra conquer the Equalist threat. Next, in Book 2, Asami has to learn how to run Sato Industries, whose stock is falling considerably once it becomes publicized that Hiroshi Sato is a criminal. In Book 3, once her company is back afloat, we see Asami help Korra on her search for airbenders. And in Book 4, we see Asami as one of the world's leading industrialists, helping redesign Republic City. She also learns to forgive her father in the last book, leading to a moment of genuine character growth. So let's look at the start and end of Asami's character. She starts as a coddled rich kid and ends as a capable and poised innovator. If that's not character growth, I don't know what is. So then, let's look at MaCo. He's introduced as your typical brooding cool guy that takes himself too seriously. Throughout the course of Book 1, he becomes a more genuine character as he develops feelings for Korra. Then, in Book 2, we're introduced to a lot of what I mentioned before, about characters having clashing goals, and interestingly enough, they all center around MaCo and his new job as a cop. Korra has to balance being the Avatar and working outside of the law sometimes with having MaCo, who works for the Republic City Police, as a boyfriend. Bolin, who is used to having MaCo there to support him all the time, now has to deal with finding something to do on his own since MaCo has a job, which leads him to become a mover star. Finally, Asami has to choose between trusting MaCo's word or Varric, the man who is helping her keep her company from going under. Now, Book 2 is probably the worst of the 4 books in The Legend of Korra, but I do think that the character conflict is all pretty reasonable and organic. It makes sense to think that work can come between relationships with your significant other, with your family, and with your friends, and I do think this is shown pretty well with MaCo. In Book 3, we see MaCo as sort of a goofball. After breaking up with Korra and Asami twice each, he understandably feels awkward around them, but nonetheless decides to help Korra on her mission because 1. Bolin begs him, and 2. Deep down he knows they're still friends. In Book 3, we're able to see the softer side of MaCo when he meets his dad's family. I mean, look at the scene where he gives his grandmother his dad's scarf. Here, MaCo shows trust and care in a woman he hardly knows by giving her his most prized possession simply because they're family. And remember what the scarf means to him. He tells Asami in Book 1 that his dad's scarf makes him feel like he's safe. And now he wants to turn that sense of safety over to his grandmother. Can people look at this scene and make a serious case to me that MaCo doesn't develop and isn't a compelling character? Finally, in Book 4, we see MaCo in a completely different role. Not pro-bender, not detective, but personal bodyguard to Prince Wu. After 3 seasons, I like how the writers decide to give MaCo someone completely new to play off of. Prince Wu allows us to see a more mature, mentor-like characteristic in MaCo, as he gives Wu a reality check into his conceited nature while protecting him at the same time. I personally also found their dynamic to be pretty funny. MaCo starts out as a brooding teenager who thinks he can take care of himself and his brother alone, and grows into a skilled detective who learns to work with his friends and is willing to put his life on the line to help Korra. Next, we have Bolin. Bolin is introduced as the comic relief character. Book 1 portrays him as a perpetual optimist. He's basically just a funny guy who is shown to care about his friends and wants to keep everyone together, even amidst conflict within Team Avatar. In Book 2, we see a completely different side to him emerge as a result of a fundamental challenge to his values as a person. Bolin is used to having others with him to such a great extent that when everyone goes off to do their own thing, he doesn't really know what to do. He is so used to being the glue that holds the team together that he doesn't know how to act when the glue wears off. He's genuinely hurt when his friends leave him, so he replaces his optimism with egoism and childishness for the first half of the season. This is seen most clearly when, after becoming a mover star, Bolin refuses to help out his brother. Book 2 may not be a positive change in his character, but it is a reasonable reaction from someone as idealistic as Bolin, who has been recently hurt by those closest to him. In the second half of Book 2, we see a revival of the Book 1 Bolin, which continues on to Book 3. Book 3 also sees Bolin face another challenge to his optimism, metal bending. His inability to metal bend is a representation of his weakness, something that Bolin would rather not think about as an optimist. Learning to eventually acknowledge his shortcomings as a metal bender, however, leads him to grow closer with Opal, as she too has problems confronting her mother about wanting to learn airbending outside of Zaofu. Bolin's failure as a metal bender also allows him to command the strength to perform lava bending. Finally, in Book 4, we have the most interesting threat to Bolin's idealistic perspective, Kuvira. Bolin initially believes that everything Kuvira is doing is right, and that he's legitimately helping out the people of the Earth Kingdom by following her. He ignores the warnings of both Opal and MaCo because he trusts in the good that he thinks he is doing. But once he sees Kuvira's tyrannical nature, he realizes that his idealism was severely misplaced. He realizes that he should have trusted those closest to him, his family and his loved ones, above his sense of optimism. I love the way Bolin's arc progressed because you really feel like he matured. He realized that instead of looking at everything in a positive light, he should acknowledge when things aren't so great. In the beginning of Book 2, we saw how dependent Bolin was on others, but by the end of Book 4, he was making his own decisions, and they were undoubtedly the right calls to make. Lastly, we have Korra. A lot of people prefer Aang as an avatar, but I could not disagree more with that sentiment. Korra is a much more interesting character than Aang. Yes, there are moments that test Aang, which I mentioned in my analysis of his character, but he did not change very much from the start to the end of the show. Korra's character development is much more profound. She is introduced as a cocky hothead who likes to act before she thinks. Learning airbending in Book 1 did little, if anything, to mellow her out, and she proceeds as a reckless avatar in Book 2 as well. I mean, she starts a civil war between the water tribes. But towards the end of Book 2, you start to see a little bit of her growth as an independent avatar, with her decision to keep the spirit portals open. Many argue that keeping the spirit portals open is not a decision that Korra had the authority to make, but as the avatar, she is the bridge between the human and spirit worlds. It is her choice to decide through what form that bridge should exist, and if it should exist at all. Korra considers the decision made by Avatar Wan, mulls over it, and concludes that he made a mistake by keeping the human and spirit worlds separate, leading to her decision to keep the spirit portals open. Regardless of whether or not you agree with Korra's decision, she did what she thought would create stability in the long term. This is in stark contrast with the vast majority of what we've seen in Korra's previous actions, which were short-sighted and done without consideration of the long-term implications. Korra's development progresses into Book 3 when she searches the world for new airbenders. The book begins with her taking a lot of heat for deciding to keep the spirit portals open from both spirits and humans. But she keeps her head high and works through the criticism, while also trying to find airbenders and help them get adjusted to their new abilities. Book 3 Korra is so different personality-wise from Book 1 Korra. Now she is much more considerate, patient, and empathetic, although she's still kind of a hothead. Then, in Book 4, we see the most character change from Korra. After being poisoned by Zahir, she is a broken avatar. She's unable to get into the avatar state and unable to perform her duties. Book 4 is a season about Korra trying to find out who she is. She's a person who's been so focused on being the avatar that once she loses her skills, she doesn't know anything else about her identity. Korra goes through the long process of healing with Katara, Toph, and Zahir, where she remembers her most painful memories, the times when she was challenged to her absolute core. Korra learns to come to terms with her failures and move on from them, to learn from them. She realizes that she has the support of her family, her friends, and people who genuinely care for her, backing everything she does. She, at the most enlightened stage she's been in 4 seasons, finds balance within herself and is therefore at her most capable in being able to bring balance to the world. Before finishing off this section, I'd like to bring up 2 quick things. First, I am in no way trying to rag on the characters in The Last Airbender. As I previously mentioned, I love those characters, and it's taking quite a bit out of me to criticize them. I'm simply trying to show why I personally believe that the protagonists in The Legend of Korra show more interesting development than the protagonists in The Last Airbender. The main heroes of The Last Airbender, Zuko being the exception, start out as good people. They don't change much because they don't need to change much. The main heroes in Korra are flawed people who all have to learn to overcome their shortcomings, assume more responsibility, and become better. The development in these aspects occur over seasons for the Korra Team Avatar, but do so over episodes in the original Team Avatar. Nevertheless, I'm not trying to argue that they are better characters in general, but simply that they change in more fascinating ways. It makes me really sad to hear when people say that Korra is a show with terrible characters and terrible writing, because I do think that that's an unfair assessment. Sure, the characters may not be as fleshed out as the original Team Avatar characters, but keep in mind that Korra also had to devote time to introducing a new premise, new villains, and new conflicts in each season. Second, I understand that the events of The Last Airbender take place within a few months, while the events of The Legend of Korra happen on the order of years, but this does not change my point. I will admit, however, that the time span obviously aids The Legend of Korra relative to The Last Airbender with respect to dynamic characterization, especially between Book 3 and Book 4 of Korra, where there's a 3-year time skip. With those 2 clarificatory points mentioned, I maintain my position that as a sequel, The Legend of Korra tried something new with its main protagonists, which produced captivating character development. Now let's look at the villains in The Last Airbender versus The Legend of Korra. Fans of The Last Airbender generally admit that Korra's villains are superior. I think that this is the case for 2 reasons. First, all of Korra's villains possess base motives and ideologies that the audience can at least partially relate with. People like to make the claim that the best villains are those who genuinely believe they are doing the right thing with their actions. I don't think this is entirely true. After all, some people just want to watch the world burn and they make excellent villains. I do think, however, that if done properly, giving a villain a reasonable motive for their actions that audience members can relate to is useful for creating a compelling character. Second, I think that The Legend of Korra did a much better job of creating a connection between Korra and the villain she was fighting than The Last Airbender did. Please keep in mind that I believe that the connection between Aang and Zuko was excellent. Their progression from enemies to friends felt natural and earned, and I absolutely loved the transitions between Aang and Zuko in some of the episodes. However, I do not consider him the main villain of Season 1, and he certainly wasn't the main villain of Books 2 or 3. As such, I won't be addressing him in this section. Also, before we go further into the villains of each show, I want to again reiterate that I am not trying to defame The Last Airbender here. I'm simply trying to show how Korra was able to do something unique with its villains that its predecessor was unable to do, thereby giving it a lot of merit as a sequel. So let's start with The Last Airbender. In Book 1, the main villain was Zhao. In Book 2, the main villain was Azula, and in Book 3, the main villain was Ozai. Yes, there are other antagonists in the series, but I'd like to focus on these 3. If we look at what their motivations are, it's hard to extend their drive beyond the generic world domination or ultimate power for the Fire Nation. Zhao wants to conquer the Northern Water Tribe and gain fame for himself. Azula generally wants the Fire Nation to win the war and conquer the other kingdoms, and Ozai wants to rule over the entire world. While these motivations are fine, there is absolutely no justification for them at all. The reason why Thanos is the most popular villain in the MCU has a lot to do with his perspective and values. He thinks he can achieve long-term stability and balance through killing people, which would ultimately increase the amount of the world's resources. He's obviously a crazy person for wanting to murder half of the world's population, but his underlying motivations are something that people can say, okay, I can kind of understand where he's coming from. This is in such contrast with the villains that the MCU normally churns out, who are just generic evildoers who the audience probably can't even remember after watching the movie. Zhao and Ozai are the same. They may be flashy with their firebending, but overall they meet the basic requirements of a generic villain and nothing more. Azula is much more interesting than the other two, but I'll get to her in a minute. In regards to how Aang relates to Zhao and Ozai, there isn't a whole lot to see. Aang literally taunts Zhao, leading him to destroy his own ships in the Deserter. In Nightmares and Daydreams, it's clear that Aang is nervous about his fight with Ozai, but he gets over it in one episode. By the end of the show, he's less scared of Ozai than he is of the fact that he may have to take a person's life. Aang doesn't really have a connection with Azula, minus the fact that she shot him full of lightning in Book 2, but Zuko does. Because Zuko becomes a protagonist by the end of the series, we're able to see an emotional, riveting Agni Kai between the siblings to see who's truly worthy of becoming Fire Lord. Azula also may not have interesting motivations, but she is a deeply interesting character who is excellently written. Her cool confidence, transforming into paranoia and eventual insanity, is gradual and believable, unlike in some shows. She's cold, calculating, extremely perceptive, and charismatic. Not to mention she's actually hilarious. She's by far the best antagonist in The Last Airbender, but Ozai and Zhao fail to match her as far as interesting villains go. Okay, then how about The Legend of Korra? We start with Amon. Amon is my absolute favorite antagonist in both series. Bloodbending was introduced but hardly used in The Last Airbender because only two bloodbenders exist, one of them eventually being apprehended and the other being Katara, who has deep moral afflictions about using the skill for obvious reasons. Korra took a concept that had potential and nurtured it. Amon and Tarlok can bloodbend even when there isn't a full moon out. Amon can bloodbend with his mind and can even take people's bending away with his bloodbending powers. Furthermore, he's motivated by reasonable concerns. When you, as an audience member, are introduced to Republic City, you see a bunch of benders who are part of a gang demand protection money. Amon isn't wrong when he says that benders take advantage of non-benders, which is why he garners so much support for the equalist cause. When considering the relationship that Amon has with Korra, it is clear that he inspires genuine fear within her. The voice in the night shows that Korra is understandably terrified of Amon's powers. In the final episode, Endgame, we as audience members are terrified that Amon is going to catch Korra and take her bending away. I mean, at this point, it's no joke, since he's already taken the bending of Zolt, Tano, Lin's officers, Lin herself, and countless others. Amon is a frightening and formidable antagonist, which is only expounded upon by his incredible speed and quick perception. Korra is able to summon the power to airbend and beat Amon because of her worry for MaCo, which was greater than anything else she was feeling at the moment, be it fear, shame, or dejection. I wish we got to see more of Amon, as his final fight with Korra felt rushed, but his disappointing end doesn't make him any less of an excellent villain. Let's then take a look at Unalaq, the villain of the second season. He's Korra's uncle and a man who has grown angry by humans' failure to respect the spirits, and he's right. The Glacier Spirits Festival has transformed into a celebration of food and games, losing its inherent purpose of praising the spirits. Humans have a lot to learn from the spirits, such as respect for nature, which was lost by Avatar 1, severing the connection between the human and spirit worlds. Korra understood that Unalaq was trying to usher in a new spiritual age with his Dark Avatar scheme, so she tried to go about that in the right way by keeping the spirit portals open. As for his relationship with Korra, he did help her achieve at least some level of spiritual enlightenment. Her training with Unalaq allowed her to perform spirit bending, and it also enabled her to appreciate Tenzin more once she found out that Unalaq was using her. Next, there's Zahir and the Red Lotus. Zahir is considered to be the best villain in The Legend of Korra by the fan base, and it's easy to tell why. He's the only violent airbender we see in both shows, and he chooses to perform airbending tactics that the monks would never perform. He's also an anarchist who believes that the common man shouldn't have to be subject to the authority of world leaders or those of a higher status. This is seen when he kills the Earth Queen and has Ghazan destroy the walls of Ba Sing Se. Anarchism is a deeply nuanced political ideology, and I'm growing more and more impatient with the people who say that Zahir's ideals are baseless. There are usually two general attacks that people make with respect to anarchism. First, that it's just something that's inherently violent, both before and after it's established. This isn't the case. Just like there are many different ways to get to democracy, there are many different ways to get to anarchy. There's a whole sect of anarchy known as anarcho-pacifism, spearheaded by Henry David Thoreau and Leo Tolstoy, that specifically involves undermining governmental institutions in non-violent ways through civil disobedience. Yes, Zahir's methods were violent, but there is no evidence to show that in the long run he wants a society where people steal, commit crimes, and run rampant. Rather, it's something that he expects in the short term. He echoes Guru Lahima's words, saying new growth cannot exist without first the destruction of the old. He knows that people will run amok at first, but eventually they'll have the freedom to make decisions that benefit society in a collective manner without the influence of world leaders and with the continued guidance of the Red Lotus. This brings me to my next argument that people have against anarchism. It always reverts back to state authority. This obviously isn't the case since anarchist communities continue to persist to this day, with some having lasted for decades. In Zahir's case, people argue that his anarchist ideals led to the rise of Kuvira, who is exactly the kind of person who Zahir was fighting against. I have two responses to this. First, the entire purpose of the Red Lotus is to prevent authority figures like Kuvira from coming into power. If its members hadn't been taken out by Korra and her friends, then they would have clamped down on Kuvira before she amassed a large amount of support, thus preventing a return to rule by a singular authority. Second, Zahir does believe in change through re-education. He talked about his desire to train the Avatar, to believe in freedom rather than blindly follow orders from figures of authority, which, by the way, is something that Korra does throughout the entire show. It makes sense that Zahir would not only want to re-educate the Avatar, but also re-educate the entire world on what freedom is and how to wield it responsibly. Also, keep in mind that Zahir helps Korra take Kuvira down by helping her enter the spirit world. This shows that even if he's indirectly caused Kuvira's rise, he's willing to help the Avatar take her down, since doing so would bring the world closer to his ideal, even if it's not by much. Anyway, sorry for the inclusion of political history, but I couldn't really help myself. As for the relationship with Korra, I already discussed how he wanted to raise her to believe in freedom, but beyond that, he's the man who broke her. Fighting with Amon forces Korra to summon her power to airbend, and him taking away her powers gives her the ability to energy bend along with the Avatar state. Fighting with Unalaq increases Korra's sense of spirituality, allowing her to spirit bend. Yes, she loses her connections with her past avatars in her fight with Unavatu, but this isn't as dire a consequence as what happens to her following her fight with Zahir. At the end of Book 3, Korra is broken. The new airbenders have to assume her responsibilities since she's in a recuperation stage and Kuvira has to control the Earth Kingdom. Zahir may be the man who broke Korra, but he is also the man who helped her heal. Their dynamic is definitely an interesting one, definitely more so than the other villains in the Avatar universe. Moving on to Book 4, we have Kuvira. Kuvira is basically the good version of Ozai. Her main motivation is bringing order to an Earth Kingdom that was left in shambles after Zahir's intrusion. She brings up good points in her fight for order, such as the fact that Zaofu hoards its resources, and that she doesn't want a weak-willed leader to assume power again. Kuvira, much like Azula, is able to manipulate people using fear, including Bolin and Barrack. She's also extremely callous, willing to kill her own fiancé if he's a roadblock to her goals. Her relationship with Korra is developed enough. Kuvira did save Korra's father from falling to his death in Book 3, giving Korra the impression that Kuvira can be reasoned with. In their last conversation in the spirit world, Korra understands that Kuvira, much like herself, was afraid. Kuvira was afraid that when Su refused to take power and Korra was missing, that no one could protect the Earth Nation. Kuvira was especially hurt because being an orphan, she didn't want her own country to be cast aside like she was. It was fear that drove Kuvira to rule with such an unforgiving iron will. In the last book, we're able to see Korra force a villain to turn herself in using nothing but words, which is a testament to how much she has grown as an avatar. I'd like to briefly touch on 2 points concerning all of Korra's villains before moving on to the final section. First, what I really appreciate about Korra is it shows you the problems that the villains in the series are trying to address, which makes them more nuanced antagonists and may even cause you to support them a little. We see the Bender gangs taking advantage of non-Benders in Book 1, support Amon's fight for equality and the elimination of bending. We see the spirits terrorizing the Southern Water Tribe in Book 2, lending credence to Unalaq's desire for spirituality. We see the Earth Queen acting out of her own interests rather than those of her people in Book 3, making Zahir's plan to eliminate world leaders and return freedom to the people seem like a good idea. In Book 4, we see roving banditry and poverty in the Earth Kingdom, leading us to believe that Kuvira is restoring order and prosperity even if her methods are severe. Furthermore, the ideologies of the villains manifest into actual change in the world. Amon's quest for equality led to the establishment of a president in Republic City rather than a council of benders. Unalaq's desire for a renewal of spirituality was answered with Korra's decision to keep the spirit portals open. Zahir's desire for freedom is balanced with Kuvira's desire for order, with the creation of independent Earth Kingdom states with democratically elected governments rather than a continued monarchy. The final aspect of The Legend of Korra that I think makes it a worthy sequel to The Last Airbender has to do with bending. In The Last Airbender, we're introduced to destructive fire bending, booming earth bending, graceful water bending, and flowing air bending. The stances these different types of benders take when performing their respective bending is largely influenced by their values and ways of life. Earthbenders are a tough and proud people, and earthbending requires a strong and steady stance. Airbenders are peaceful people who hate direct confrontations, which is why airbending tactics are focused on evasion and misdirection. Waterbenders are a communal people, so their bending is focused on grace and healing. Most firebenders are violent and confrontational people, which is why their bending is fueled by anger. In addition to this, The Last Airbender introduces us to specialized versions of these bending types. Lightning bending, combustion bending, blood bending, healing, and metal bending all take on base bending types and improve upon them. The Legend of Korra goes even further with bending in regards to how people interact with the new world. There is now a metal bending police task force. You can make a living using lightning bending to power a factory. Of course, there's pro bending as well. Korra, like The Last Airbender, also expounds upon specialized bending abilities and novel ways to use bending. This is seen especially in relation to the show's antagonists. Amon invents psychic blood bending, as well as the ability to take people's bending away through a means other than energy bending. Unalaq introduces us to spirit bending. Zahir basically becomes a flying anarchist Spider-Man once he gets airbending, since his mobility is vastly enhanced, and he shows us just how formidable an unhinged airbender can be. Kuvira uses metal sheets attached to her armor to promote a versatile fighting style, where she's able to quickly attack, defend, or threaten. The Last Airbender was also able to connect emotion to the way different people performed bending. Zuko, for instance, fueled his firebending through rage and a desire to find the Avatar, so once he joined up with Aang, his firebending was greatly weakened. The Legend of Korra does this as well. If you look at Korra, when you first meet her, she's constantly using firebending. But as the show progresses, she opts to use airbending more and more, and attempts to de-escalate situations. This is a clever way that the writers choose to show that Korra grows from an impulsive avatar to one that is more patient. I hope everyone watching understands that I love both shows, and I'm not trying to change anyone's opinions through this video. Everyone has the right to their own views and beliefs, so long as those beliefs don't render active harm to other people. I simply want to express my views as to why I think Korra is a worthy sequel. Let me know what you think about the points that I bring up in this video. I'm thinking about making more Legend of Korra and Last Airbender videos, and I definitely think revisiting these past shows is a good idea with the new Netflix version on the horizon. Thank you all for sitting through this very, very long video, and hopefully I'll see you next time.